There is another god other than the original Nines that is not well known, but has become a reality of life on Ain. He had came to be when the god Malacath had crashed into the En. Not only was this crash so great that it broke up En itself, it also caused Malacath to be split from his very spirit. This spirit would remain in the depths of Alu even after Malacath had escaped. Unbeknown to Malacath himself, his spirit would begin to take form and gain in strength, becoming self-aware of its own existence, resulting in its desire for freedom. During his time in the watery depths, Malacath's corruption would be known to spread around the area of the crash site known as Ashanti's Swamp in the Isle of Ikuda, where the undead flourished, spreading mass hysteria amongst the kin there, who would succumb to the infection, creating an undead race that would later be recreated and called the Skjal. This corruption would remain long after Malacath had disappeared, reaching out of the swamp and across parts of Volraya and even the corners of Layla, infecting the life forms there. This infection of Skjal would attack and kill all other living species within close range, spreading the infection further. The only living species that was safe from this plague were the Kai, whose godlike purity granted them immunity from this new corruption. The Skjal would thrive as the dominant race within the Isles of Ikuda, until the Aku-Nai used their form of dark magicka to banish them to the realm of the dead known as the Underworld. Malacath's spirit would gain enough strength to leave its murky chamber and scoured the land as a shadowy mass, looking for purpose with its newly gained life. It would find it within the existence of a mortal named Essera. This mortal would be the vessel it needed to complete its uprising to conquer the Isles of Ikuda and dominate the nation known as the Aku-Nai. With the remaining forces of its undead army, this shadow of Malacath would then reform its race of the undead, now known as the Skjal, from the fallen Aku-Nai. This new batch of the undead would prove to be different in nature and became defiant of their master. They still held the desire for life and their freedom, upholding the sheer will of the kin they once were. Using their knowledge of the dark arts, they would forge a new practice known as soul reviving. This new practice would go on as another school of dark magicka that would later be taught to others as necromancy. Necromancy would be taught throughout the land as something forbidden, and only strong magi can understand its teachings, thus allowing such strong individuals to practice it, creating a secretive cult of necromancers, powerful enough to rival the Elkai Dominion's degree of magicka. The god that sired this new teaching of dark magicka would not be recognized as such. Choosing to remain anonymous while in its mortal body would reap the efforts of its growing legacy in privacy. During its period of time exploring Ain, it came to a realization that the life forms of this world were beginning to repopulate at a vast rate, and because there was no wars waged to help cull them out at the time, there was no extinguishing of life to be done. This brought on the threat of Ain being overpopulated, thus overthrowing the very balance of nature. This was something that the anonymous god somehow knew and thought of a solution. It would shed its mortal shell and stand as its true self, claiming a new name known as Noctis. Noctis would retain his true form, choosing to only be seen by those of the dead or dying. The living would not be able to see him with their naked eye. However, one whose third eye is open may be able to gaze upon him. The concept of death first came to be after he was split from Malacath. It is only now that he would claim the phenomenon as his own, officially becoming the god of death. Roaming the land, he would seek to collect the souls of the living. Rather than reap the souls himself, Noctis would patiently wait for the timely death of the individual. The means of death could happen either through the malice intent of a mortal's act on another, the passing of old age, or a complete accident. However, one's fate is sealed once their time has come to expire, and he would be there waiting to bring their soul to his watery domain known as the Underworld. It is as cold and dark as one can imagine, and the sirens of the souls trapped within the swirling whirlpool of their prison is music to his ears. With the new age of war brimming also comes the call of duty. Death is on a high rise as hatred is spread throughout a nation of opposing factions. The bitter battles are long fought and seem to be endless, fruitless in their reasons. Noctis remains unknown as he watches on with contempt for either side, never one to meddle in the affairs of the mortals. He would, however, take notice to the mass amount of death by the hands of these malicious mortals. Who knew that such creatures could be so violent? And over what, he wondered. This perplexed him over the years as the mortals waged war with one another whilst he busily collected the damned souls by the numbers. As he would carry about, he couldn't help but think to himself how wasteful this all was, to throw away one's life for the sake of... The reason still escaped him. Still, he had a job to do which was becoming quite taxing to him, more so on his morale than his self-being. He needed help, but this would not be made known to Noctis until that one fateful day when he met a mortal named Nymphis. Nymphis, as a mortal, was nothing too out of the ordinary. He would have his soul collected just as any other. However, it was his colourful personality that had drawn Noctis to spare him the gravid grave below. Nymphis, at the time, was a fighter in one of the wars set on Ain. He was a beastkin known as a volkin, a species not known for getting involved with wars. Nymphis, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy the mirths of battle. He often wore a wide grin on his face when heavily engaged in combat, and despite his lithe build, he seemed to be able to carry himself well. There was another glaring fact about this young Volkin that Noctis couldn't ignore, the fact that Nymphis had a fascination for mayhem. While others would turn away from such grotesque acts, such as missing limbs or open wounds, Nymphis lived for it. It was as if it was his calling to be this chaotic. Nymphis' short reign of anarchy would come to a quick end, his chaotic nature leading him into his timely death, the time Noctis was waiting for. In the heat of battle, Nymphis would charge into the fray of the enemy head-on and weapons blaring. He would be suddenly struck down by a behemoth of a Ursin, quickly ending the Volkin's life. The release of his soul came just as quickly as his demise, something Noctis wished to never see again. He'd approached the confused soul with sympathy and offered his condolences, errant of his behaviour, as he does not do this with other souls, and rather than be dismayed or feel remorse over his own death, Nymphis took it rather well, accepting his fate. He turned to Noctis and asked him what was to happen to him next. Noctis had to think over this for a moment, the strange beastkin having made a mark on him. He figured he could use someone who didn't mind the woes of war to help him in his duties. Nymphis took to this idea rather quickly and became Noctis' steward. Nymphis would become Niam of souls and would go on to become a legend, thanks to the god of death.